All righty, it's 11 o'clock and we will get started with our next panel, panel 4, Strategies for Adaptation and Action. My name is Sarah Jones. I'm the Director of Sustainability and Community Engagement with the ski area and a member of the steering committee. And I have to say that as a practitioner of the work that's being done, I love the format of the Yampa Basin Rendezvous. We really start with the science, and really our goal is to bring science to action. So I'm so excited for this panel and to be introducing this panel, because this is what is, for me, what it's all about. So welcome. I wanted to start us off by recognizing the great speakers that we have today, and Elise will be introducing all of them, but just to recognize Elise Asengo, Carrie Talbot, Kate Greenberg, and Rob Billerbeck. So with that, I will introduce our moderator today, Elise Asengo. Elise is the Community Science Manager for Aspen Global Change Institute, which is a nonprofit committed to advancing global change science and solutions. Elise manages the AGCI's IRON program, a long-term soil, moisture, and meteorological network in the Roaring Fork watershed of Colorado. Her work includes site maintenance, data collection, and engagement with local partners and community members. Elise holds a BA in biology and English from St. Olaf College and an MA in conservation biology from Miami University, Ohio. She is the lead editor for the Mountain Views Chronicle. Elise, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much, and take it away.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So I just wanted to start by acknowledging the really wonderful discussions we've had over the past 2 days. I think this has been a thought-provoking and really engaging rendezvous that we've had so far. So thank you to all of you who are joining us for this final session, Strategies for Adaptation and Action. In this final panel, we're going to be building on a lot of the discussions that we've had so far already in the program, and moving from a kind of Yampa focused approach to looking at preparation and response to drought impacts, to looking at more of a state and even a federal level to see what's going on in dealing with the drought that we're all seeing and the potential future droughts we might move into. So throughout this panel, we're really hoping to highlight what are the pressure points and the successful strategies from work that is currently already underway. And our goal for focusing on this centralizing theme is to end the rendezvous on a note of hopefully hope that's grounded in realistic examples of impactful projects that are going on. So it's my pleasure to introduce Carrie Talbot, Kate Greenberg, and Rob Billerbeck. Each of our panelists are going to be representing a different key stakeholder community of water management, agriculture, and recreation. So Carrie is going to be starting us off. Carrie Talbot is the chief of the Flood and Storm Protection Division in the Coastal and Hydraulics Laboratory of the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center. He comes from a background of environmental engineering with a BS and an MS from Brigham Young University and a PhD from the University of Connecticut. Carrie supervises the execution of research and development activities in a wide range of coastal, hydraulic, and hydrologic engineering, data collection, and analysis applications. He also serves as the program manager of the Forecast Informed Reservoir Operations Program, or FIRO, which is assessing the viability of using advanced hydrometeorological forecasting capabilities and hydrologic and water management tools to operate reservoirs more efficiently for multi-purpose benefits. Welcome, Carrie. And as you begin, if you wouldn't mind orienting us all by sharing what watershed you're calling in from today.
Thank you, Elise. Appreciate the kind introduction there. And I'm calling in from, I guess, from the Mississippi River watershed, because the Mississippi River is only about a mile that way from where I'm currently sitting. So glad to have the opportunity to meet with you today. I wish it could have been done in your beautiful setting there. Both of my parents are originally from the state of Utah, and in fact, I was just in Utah just a couple of weeks ago, and then also once earlier this summer, and I drove through Colorado. I've never been up into the Yampa River Basin, though, at least that I can recall, and I when the invitation had come earlier this summer to participate in this, I was very much looking forward to it. So I will take a rain check on being able to visit your basin sometime in the near future. I do love going to the West though, so any opportunity I get to do that, I appreciate. So I want to just take a few minutes and give you a very brief overview of this program called Forecast Informed Reservoir Operations and some lessons that we've learned about that hit on the themes that you're talking about in your rendezvous, and that Elise mentioned are the part of the goals for this this panel. And so I'll go to the next slide, and hopefully you're seeing, yeah, okay, I think you're seeing all the slides, correct? And not just not the presenter view. Okay, good. So why is the Corps doing this, right? So the simple answer is that there was a change made to what we call our engineer regulations. We're part of it's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, right? So we're part of the Department of Defense. We have regulations that govern, that are our policy documents. And the one that governs what's called water control management made a change about 5 years ago that added this sentence that's highlighted on the screen here, that for the very first time added the two words that are indicated there in red, that forecasted conditions can now be used for planning future operations. It's never said that before. And so the engineer regulations tell us what you can and can't do, but they don't tell you how to do it. That comes through other means. And so this R&D effort that I have the great privilege of leading is to define how that can be safely and effectively implemented across the Corps. And so these assessments that we're conducting we're assessing the viability of FIRO at several different pilot sites. These are setting important policy application precedents for the Corps, as well as all of the other partner agencies that we work with across the country, really, but also very specifically in the West. And one thing I want to point out too is this last bullet on the slide here is that FIRO seeks to improve water availability, not necessarily changing allocation. Right? We're trying to make the water supply more reliable and find a better balance between water supply and flood risk management, as well as ecosystem benefits. So with that, let's move on to the next slide here. So one of the key things that we have learned in this is that collaboration is the key to FIRO's success. The pilots sites, and I'll mention what they are here in just a minute, the 4 pilots that we're working on right now, they're led by interagency steering committees that are carefully formed with senior representatives from the stakeholder agencies, as well as academic partners that are working in that area. And they're blends of engineers and scientists from the research, operations, as well as regulatory perspectives. That's very key that we have these different perspectives there. And there's something else that's really important here, and that is that in each of the basins that we're looking at, right, each of the pilot sites, they all have the stakeholders there talk to each other on regular basis, just through normal operations on it. So, but when they do meet together, it's usually because there's either some questions on the table, or there's a proposed change that's being discussed. And in general, when you have an issue like that, there's a proposed change. Most of the rest of the stakeholders' opinion is, well, they're a bit defensive in that I'm opposed to the change until I can see that it's not going to harm my interest. And so that sets up a little bit of an adversarial type relationship in the discussions. With FIRO, there's no proposed change on the table. We're just trying to see what the science will support in terms of better balance or better, improving all of the different outcomes, whether that's water supply or flood risk management or ecological benefits or recreation or whatever the interests might be. And so it's truly an opportunity where we're just trying to see, well, what does the current capability and science, whether that's forecast skill or the operational constraints of the dam and the downstream channel, what can be supported by what's currently possible? And when you've removed that kind of adversarial type relationship, it makes it such that you have an opportunity just to work together and to learn from each other and gain perspective from each other, so that you can see how that, well, if we operated this way, then that would be beneficial for this interest as well as that interest. And so it really does provide an opportunity for this collaborative environment that I'm talking about. And those logos that I have there on the screen of all the different, these federal, state, local agencies, as well as academia, those aren't just, it's not just logos on a slide. There is interaction happening between these, sometimes on a daily basis, between all of these different groups, the representatives who are working on these FARO viability assessments, where we're gaining perspective from each other as we talk about what's possible in terms of FARO being applied to that particular site. And I'm happy to report that when we discuss FARO and how we're conducting it with, for example, our representatives in Congress who are providing the funding for this, they have a keen interest in this effort, actually, and they do ask us on a regular basis for updates. And in fact, I've got one next week where we'll be talking to some representatives from some staff members from Representative Napolitano, who's a representative from Southern California, but more importantly, she's a chair of a subcommittee on transportation and infrastructure within the House. These are the kinds of comments that we get, that they want to see federal, state, local agencies all operating together. And this is exactly how they want the federal government to operate, so that when they fund something like this, that's how we approach it. It's not just one agency dictating how it's going to go, but that we work together. So I mentioned the pilot sites. So the very first one was Lake Mendocino, which is on the East Fork of the Russian River, about 100 miles north of San Francisco in the Russian River Valley. Then we have Prado Dam on the Santa Ana River in Southern California, which is a highly urbanized setting, but it does also have some uplands areas that are very mountainous and steep. Then we also have the pair of dams, New Bullards Bar and Oroville, which are on the Yuba and Feather Rivers in the Sierra foothills. And so snowmelt-driven systems of some of the largest reservoirs in California, and major contributors to that state's water project. And then the fourth one is the Howard Hanson Dam on the Green River, which is upstream of Seattle. Each of these pilots are at various stages of completion. And if you look at this slide along the bottom, you see the timeline, this viability assessment timeline, from when we select the site and form the steering committee to developing a work plan for how we're going to attack it. And we publish that work plan and then conduct what we call a preliminary viability assessment, wherein we look at kind of a whole wide range of possible scenarios. Some of them might be outside the realm of realistic in terms of being applied, but we want to push to the limits to find out what does the science fully support. So we kind of try to bookend the from current operations all the way to, if we knew forecasts perfectly, what are the range of things that we could do, and how much water, how much improvement could there be to all the different factors there, whether it's water supply, flood risk management, ecological benefits, et cetera. So then we publish the results of that preliminary viability assessment. And from that, we distill it down to, okay, what are the realistic scenarios that we need to investigate in great detail, so that it would set us up for being able to have that be an operating condition going forward. And so what we do is we conduct what we call a final viability assessment, where we investigate those scenarios and come up with a recommended operating scenario going forward. And that is published again through a peer-reviewed report that we call the FEA. Lake Mendocino published this FEA in February of this past February, excuse me. Then Prado Dam actually just had its PVA, its preliminary viability assessment, was published just at the beginning of July. And New Bullards Bar and Oroville Dams, they completed the work plan, and we're well underway with conducting the PVA for that. And then Howard Hanson, we're still in the formations stage of forming the steering committee in getting going with the effort there. So just to give you a sample of what are some of the things that we learn in a final viability assessment using Lake Mendocino, which is the very first one that we completed. We looked at 4, we distilled all the ones we tested in the PVA process and distilled that down to the 4 FERO-based alternatives that were evaluated and compared to the current operations. And from that, we were able to learn that all 4 of them allowed more water storage to be carried into dry season and also allowed the reservoir levels to be lowered ahead of major storms, which improved the flood protection or the flood risk management aspects of the dam. So in other words, both sides could win. The alternatives were evaluated against 16 different metrics, and a best option was recommended for implementation. And we also conducted an economic study showing that there were significant benefits from an economic perspective to fisheries, recreation, water supply, and flood risk management from all of the FERO scenarios that were tested. And I'm happy to report that water control manual update. So that's the actual guidance document that says how that dam is to be operated. And so it's kind of like the rule book for that reservoir now is being updated at Lake Mendocino to incorporate the FERO scenarios that we investigated, and that will become a permanent way that dam is going to be operated going forward. Here's an example of some of the tangible benefits that have already been realized, because in that process of testing FERO and assessing its viability, we actually proposed what are called major deviations to the current existing water control plan. And so that allowed us to test scenarios in the real world with real world conditions. And so in the water year 2020, so this would be in which the water year 2020 starts in October and then runs through the end of September in each year. And so you're looking at starting on this graph of the plot here, the October on the left, lower left axis is October 2019 running through April into May of 2020. You see that black line is the actual operations, where the water level of the reservoir was. That lower dashed blue line is what the current boundary is between what we call the conservation pool or the water supply pool, and the level above it is the flood pool. In other words, where they store flood water temporarily until downstream conditions are safe, and then you release that to make room for the next storm. Well, FERO says, well, do we need to release it? Because if we don't see a storm coming, then maybe we can hold on to that water. And so what we've explored with FERO is defining this dashed light blue zone of a buffer pool. In other words, variable space that allows the operators to be anywhere, have the reservoir level anywhere in there that they feel comfortable with based upon the forecast and the conditions on the ground. So if we were operating without the FERO deviation in place, then they would have had to have held to what is on the screen there is the orangish brownish line, where they would have had to have held to that lower dashed line. But because we had the deviation in place, they were actually able to, because they didn't see any large storms coming, the operators allowed that pool to rise up to the top of the upper dashed line. In other words, they filled up their buffer space. And that turned out to be extremely important, because going into the summer dry season, which turned out to be the 3rd driest year on record in the Russian River, they added about 19% more water going into that dry season, or enough water for about 22,000 homes. So this kind of thing is real. We were able to see some benefits from this, and those benefits are realized by the people who live there. And you see the quote on the right there is from an article that was written by Rachel Becker. It was published in calmatters.org in February of 2020. She interviewed a number of people, local residents there, and they've noticed the collaboration that's happening here. And as you see in Kyle Farmer's statement there, that it restored his faith in the government a little bit. So again, we've seen the benefits of this, not just in terms of real water that comes, is able to be carried into a dry season, but we're also seeing attitudes and perspectives change. So just some takeaways here in conclusion. One of the main things is that improvements to water supply, flood risk management, and ecosystem benefits aren't on opposite sides of the equation. One wins, the other has to lose. We found that that's not true. They can all realize benefits by incorporating forecast information into water management decision-making. And that's a tremendous thing to have learned from this, and it came from this collaborative approach. And this provides a significant opportunity for policy and perspective change by combining researchers, operators, and regulators that are collectively focused on improving water management strategies. And so that builds this institutional trust between these partners. They've known each other and they've worked with each other for a long time, but institutional trust is something that takes concerted effort, and an opportunity like FIRO allows that, or creates the environment for that to be built. And that allows for accommodation for each other's objectives as you go forward in making operational decisions. And finally, FIRO provides an effective means of increasing the efficiency and resiliency, and especially as we think about climate change and drier situations or more extreme storms, that we need our existing water resources infrastructure to be able to handle that better. And so FIRO is an effective means of doing that without adding, without a bucket of concrete being poured. We're not changing the dam in any structural way, we're just changing how we operate it. And I think at this point, I will end my little presentation and we can have some questions, and I'd be happy to participate in the panel discussion as we go forward.
Thank you so much, Carrie. We do have a couple of questions, so I'm going to go ahead and work through as many of those as we can get through in the next couple minutes. And if we don't have time to answer them all right away, we'll lump them into the final group discussion. So first, we have a question from Anna Wilson. She says, Carrie, can you address some of the challenges and opportunities with updating water control manuals to codify these new strategies on a more permanent basis, and whether or how FIRO viability assessments can work in parallel with those efforts, or what that timeline looks like?
Okay, so that's a good question. We've done it in both ways, right? At Lake Mendocino, the FIRO, and that was our first one. So admittedly, we had to kind of figure out how to do these viability assessments as we were executing it. And so there it was done in series, where we completed the viability assessment, and now the water control manual update is underway. Whereas with the Yuba Feather system, that actually is happening in tandem. The water control manual update process has already begun there, even though the viability assessment is, I think we're in the PVA process right now with Yuba Feather. So they can be done simultaneously, especially now that we've learned a little bit better how to do this. There is quite a process for updating the water control manual within the Corps of Engineers. And that's because these are, we're a flood risk management agency. That's our mission from the federal government. And so we take that mission very seriously, and therefore we're going to be, by nature, conservative in the decisions that are made from a water management perspective. Flooding kills more people than any other natural disaster. It's a serious deal. So we take that very seriously. And dams, of course, represent a risk just by their very existence. And so they have to be operated very carefully. So from a dam safety perspective, from a flood risk management perspective, the Corps is by nature going to be conservative in that. However, what we have found through this FIRO process is that there's water to be saved here. There's more flexibility that can be put to work, especially when there is good confidence in forecast skill. And what I've come to appreciate is that the water managers who operate these dams, they live in those basins. They know their watersheds, and they see the benefits both on the flood risk management as well as on the water supply and the ecosystem benefits and recreation, all of those things. They receive those benefits. And so they have a vested interest in making those decisions that will be best for the watershed and best for the public. And so FIRO, to me, is really about giving them, codifying, if you will, the flexibility that they have long wanted to have. And in many cases have already been using to a degree, but they've kind of been doing that a little bit out on a limb, because the water control manuals are pretty rigidly written, most of them written decades ago, that dictate, as soon as the water is above that dashed line that separates conservation from flood pool, they're supposed to release that water. Well, they've been fudging a lot on that because can trust their forecasts and they know that that water is valuable. And so FERO is really about putting in writing what they've long wanted or have in some cases have already been doing anyway. And that's really, to me, what a key point here is that the water managers, they've just needed flexibility because they already understand how better to operate their watersheds in such a way that these multiple benefits can all be realized.
Thank you, Carrie. I have one more quick question for you before we move on. Taylor Winchell would like to know what forecasting models form the basis of FERO?
So that's a good question. I guess in principle, the Corps is always going to look to the National Weather Service, what are called the River Forecast Centers. They provide the inflow forecasts that we use. Now, that doesn't mean that we only use those. We can look at other models as well. And as FERO has developed, we have partnerships with the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes, who also are producing basin-specific forecasts across the West. And those basin-specific forecasts are informed by, for example, the atmospheric river reconnaissance missions and other things that I think you've probably had some presentations on throughout your rendezvous. And so those water managers have become more conversant in how to use ensemble forecasts, where it's not just one deterministic forecast, but that they see the range of models. And when those ranges of models are tightly clustered, they're able to have more confidence in those models, whereas if they see maybe a wide spread between the models, then maybe that's a less certain forecast and they may want to hedge more a little conservative. So I guess I would say that there's not any one single forecast product that they use. The water managers are becoming more conversant about using an array of tools, but we're always going to look to the river forecast centers first. And so having that tie between the NOAA, the National Weather Service, who have the responsibility to provide those forecasts to us, but we're always wanting them to use the best tools available. And so we want to encourage them to, adopt the these newer capabilities and newer forecast skill tools as they're made available to us.
Thank you so much, Carrie. So I know we still have a couple outstanding questions. Carrie, you are welcome to address them in the chat, or we can return to them again at the end. We should have plenty of time for group panel discussion. So we're next going to turn from the water management side of things to the water user side of things. And I'm excited to introduce Kate Greenberg. Kate Greenberg serves as Colorado's first female Commissioner of Agriculture and was appointed by Governor Jared Polis in December of 2018. As Commissioner, Greenberg provides leadership and direction to the Colorado Department of Agriculture, which serves producers operating more than 38,700 farms and ranches in the state. She's a member of numerous state boards and commissions, current vice president of the Western U.S. Agricultural Trade Association, and the secretary-treasurer of the Western Association of State Departments of Agriculture. Commissioner Greenberg is the recipient of the Emerging Conservation Leader Award from Western Resource Advocates and a 2019 Who's Who in Agricultural honoree. She has a bachelor's degree in environmental studies and humanities from Whitman College and has worked in and advocated for agriculture for more than 14 years. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kate. And again, if you wouldn't mind just starting by stating the watershed that you're joining from as you begin your presentation.
Great, thanks Elise, and it's so great being with you all today. I am calling in physically from South Platte, drinking water from the Colorado as we speak, and from the southwest corner of the state originally, so down in the San Juan Basin in the Four Corners area. And I have had the pleasure of spending lots of time up in the Yampa Basin recently, and I'm very excited to be here with the Rendezvous and also thinking about kind of what I've learned from the Yampa and how we're kind of applying that to a statewide perspective out west. But first I want to start with just a little background on agriculture in the state of Colorado, why it matters. So next slide, please. So agriculture is one of our driving economies in the state. We have over 31 million acres in production, 2.8 billion crop economy contribution, a much larger contribution to the economy when you take into account all the other jobs and businesses related to agriculture. Over 38,000 farms and ranches, and of course, cow-calf operations, livestock is our state's leading agricultural production. But of course, we produce all kinds of products. Wheat, dairy, corn are big commodities, but we've also got incredible specialty crops. Our Pueblo chili, which the festival for Pueblo chili is coming up. Of course, Palisade peaches. We have a growing wine industry, lots of growing small scale diversified farmers and ranchers really doing direct to consumer marketing. So our ag landscape is diverse, it's vast, it covers all 64 counties and impacts all of our lives, whether or not we know it. Next slide, please. And of course, agriculture and water go hand in hand. While we have dry farming in the state, we, for example, grow pinto beans down in my neck of the woods in Dove Creek in a dry farming scenario where you wait for rains to grow your crop. And of course, that is changing for a lot of producers in the state. Everything else we do to grow food relies on water and relies on our policy decisions about where water goes, where it flows, and how we value who gets water under our prior appropriation system. But with that, I think there's a fundamental cultural element to our ag community in Colorado, and that involves the skill, the grit, the community, and the resilience that we see in ag. And all of those sort of qualities of the way ag does business and the way ag survives, in my mind, is really critical for how we address the issues of drought, of climate resilience, and what we want Colorado to look like in the future. Next slide, please. So of course, we are in a prolonged drought last 20 years and seeing the impacts front and center right on our doorstep this year. I've been out in the field about every week over the summer, visiting folks who are wrangling with the realities of drought and water scarcity. Of course, the drought monitor looked a lot worse earlier in the summer, and we've seen persistent D4 drought across the western slope for many, many months. So, I think there's actually, of course, more to the story than that drought monitor, something we talk about quite a lot, and that's why we get out in the field. So I've been all around the state from the southeast down in the lower arc to the southwest. This picture on this slide was from the Ute Mountain Ute Farm and Ranch. I'll talk about that in a second. We held our statewide drought tour in the Yampa Basin just a few weeks ago, and just an extra thank you to those of you on the phone today who helped organize or spoke at that event. We were able to bring legislators, agency officials, and others who make decisions on water and drought out into the field to meet with ranchers, farmers, water managers, business owners to talk about the critical importance of the Yampa River to all of us, as well as to the environment, and how we find collaborative ways to move into a watertight future. Producers are in a position of making really tough choices right now, and this matters to us for a number of reasons. For one, we have family farmers and ranchers all across the state whose livelihoods come from the land. Right now, they are selling their herds. They have lost crops to grasshoppers, not to mention lack of water. Down at Ute Mountain Ute, they typically have 110 irrigated crop circles. This year they have 8, just based on the water availability out of Big Feedy Reservoir. So that is just a painting part of the picture of the really tough choices that families are making right now about their livelihoods, about their stewardship, and about the future of their business. One thing I want to highlight, though, is the opportunities that this time is forcing upon us. Of course, it's forcing the tough decisions, but it's also forcing adaptation. And if farmers and ranchers can do anything, it is adapt to incredibly tough conditions. Of course, these are new conditions we're facing, but we have a community of people who have, throughout the generations, made it through incredible adversity and found solutions. So you'll see there the grain bins on that photo on the farm and ranch down outside Towak in Montezuma County. What Farm and Ranch decided to do when they realized what their water reality would be this year is really drive production into their high value crops. Farm and Ranch Enterprises has the Bow and Arrow brand, if you've ever seen that. It's cornmeal, and they do all kinds of products for retail sales. So they were able to keep their mill, their processing mill for cornmeal and other products up and running. So those 3 bins have blue, white, and yellow corn. They've been able to retain those jobs for the cornmeal processing, and they're really thinking about now how can we keep our ag production up with drought tolerant crops, with high value crops, with an operation that retains jobs and gets those high value products to people. Next slide, please. And then drought tour in the Yampa Basin. This was the bedrock of hope, of resilience in my mind. I think the Yampa provides such an incredible spotlight on what is possible when, to Carrie's points, we figure out how to collaborate and work across work to build alliances across sectors to work toward a shared outcome. We spoke with the Stankos out on their ranch, that photo with the green grass, which is not the kind of production you normally see in their operation, but talking about different crop types, right? So, farmers and ranchers in the valley are used to, we've got cool season grasses. That's not working as well anymore, given the rising temperatures we're seeing. That photo in the middle is a pretty stark example of what a lot of the ranching community is dealing with. And a point I want to make there is that we were meeting with incredible land stewards, that these folks have been investing for generations in the health of the land and the health of their herd and how to move and manage water on the land. But what we're facing now is bigger than a single effort towards stewardship. It's bigger than what we can do at one farm or one ranch level in terms of conservation. But that said, that photo on the right was, that was our group of folks, the ranchers who were showing us the realities on the landscape, the elected officials and agency officials who were there trying to think about collaborative policy tools to address this incredibly large issue of drought and climate change. Next slide, please. Are you able to click to the next slide? Well, while we're waiting for the next slide, we also, during the drought tour, were able to talk about the interconnection of agriculture with the broader watershed. So talking about forest health, river health, and how agriculture can be a partner with our conservation community and others in achieving those shared goals. And I think that's a really important point for me in this role, is that, as a Department of Ag, thinking statewide, we want to be a partner in these bigger issues. Agriculture has a very important role to play in stewardship, in land management, and so much of what is going on in the Yampa Basin is a microcosm of what we see elsewhere around the state. And what I am excited to see more and more of, that collaboration across agriculture and conservation communities, thinking about forest health, headwaters health as of course, essential to not only agriculture, but to our drinking water, to fire management, to climate mitigation, and so much else. Now, I have got a few more slides. If we can't pull them up, that's fine. And oh, there we go. I think we're on to the next one, if you can get there. I think the bottom line that I want to kind of bring home here, this is, all of you have such, expertise that you bring to the table and your perspective on the profession that you're in, and all of that is interconnected and connects to agriculture. So, I think for me, it's helpful to always come back to why ag matters to us as a state. Yes, it's a huge part of our economy, but that doesn't always land for those of, folks who don't live in agricultural communities. But of course, it's about food on the shelves. We did see shelves that looked like this throughout COVID, luckily not for long, because our producers were able to figure out how to adjust to our supply chain disruptions throughout the pandemic. Of course, wildlife habitat, ag and ag lands are essential to maintaining that opportunity for wildlife to have a place to live and move. Ag is a big part of air quality and water quality. Sometimes we contribute to that pollution, but we also have the potential to really mitigate and enhance. And then another piece, I think of ag as our potential, as our future reservoir for climate mitigation. Our solutions that are based in natural and working lands investments and stewardship are immense. If we can empower and resource land stewards, farmers, ranchers, others who work and live on the land to do so in such a way that helps us sequester carbon, that helps us retain water in the soil, that helps us build healthy soil that has a whole functioning ecosystem within it. And because of that, helps create healthy food that can get to the people. That is what matters to me. And that's, I think, what matters to us as a state. Whether or not you live or work on a farm or ranch, whether or not you know a farmer or rancher, that is our potential that we have to keep investing in when it comes to agriculture. Next slide, please. So in closing, 2 points I want to make. One, we've got money. This is a strange thing for us as a state Department of Ag. It's normally not the case, but we fought hard for state stimulus dollars, and we got 76 million of them to get out the door in the next few months. So we have dollars for drought relief, for renewable energy development, including agrivoltaics, so stacking solar above a working farmer ranch. We have dollars for voluntary soil health investment, for ag events, and we're establishing a loan fund for small and mid-scale processors as well as beginning farmers. So we're excited about this momentum that we saw at the legislature, this investment in agriculture. We know it's just a slice of the pie, but it's really meaningful to see dollars behind the words of our state leaders that show us that agriculture is essential to our state. Next slide, please. This is my last slide, and I want to end on the same note that Carrie really brought home, which is around collaboration. We co-chair the state's agricultural drought task force. That was the team that really brought that Yampa Basin tour together, co-chaired with the Colorado Water Conservation Board and other partners. We have used that group to kick up issues from the field that we can resolve and to elevate issues to state and federal officials about what the needs in the field really are. We're also at the table trying to find multiple benefits for water users, ag, the environment. That photo was actually taken at Elkhead Reservoir on the day the governor announced the release of 766 acre feet, I believe, for agricultural use as well as for the river itself. The governor has also sent an emergency declaration request for drought to the president in conjunction with a number of other Western governors, knowing that this is an unusual time that we're in, but is not going away, and that the impact on people's lives and livelihoods is real, it's multi-year, and we're gonna need to get serious about our systems, our resources, and the structures of our policy to address what we face in the time ahead. And with that, it all comes back to relationships, it all comes back to that trust we've been talking about, and the common vision across unlikely alliances that will build our resilience in the face of climate change, extended drought, and the pressures we see on our state. So with that, the last slide is my contact information. I'm always available for further questions, but look forward to taking some of those now.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was really great. I had a few technical difficulties, so I'm actually going to throw over to Maddie to let us know if there are questions that had been available during the chat. So Maddie, did we have any questions lined up yet?
I don't think we have any questions for Kate right now.
We do have one in-person question here from Anna.
Yes, and again, thanks everyone. The CMC internet went down, so we're now masked up and together, and that's why you've seen a few people drop off, but we're working through that. We're on my hotspot at the moment. Kate, thank you for a really wonderful presentation. I wonder what you see as kind of the key like mechanical thing about creating and building collaborations between unlikely allies. Like, what is the right way to get them on looking at the same problem in a yeah, I guess that's my question. I'll stop caveating it.
Well, I think my first introduction to kind of the tangible solutions of collaboration with unlikely allies was with the Quivira Coalition, which is a Santa Fe-based organization that tackles issues on working lands across the arid West and was founded on this principle of the radical center, and was founded by ranchers, environmentalists, researchers, public servants over 20 years ago, when all of those entities were fighting each other. They were suing each other. There was acrimony across the board, but there were a few individuals who realized they were actually working toward the same ends. They just had different ideas of how to get there. And those folks were willing to come to the table and create an organization and a culture that has persisted throughout the decades and taught me a lot about what it means to be a part of that radical center. It means negotiation. It means putting aside ideology while not letting go of what you are passionate about and what your vision is. And I think starting from a bedrock of mutual respect, regardless of those differences. I think that's a big call to action for all of us right now, given just what we're dealing with across the state, across the globe. And it's remarkably challenging and remarkably rewarding. So I hope that we can just all continue to invest in the Radical Center in our own lines of work.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Kate. I'll give one more opportunity before we move on, that if anyone wants to put a question in chat. Oh, it looks like Marty Ralph has a question for you, Kate.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Greenberg, for joining us and for your wonderful presentation. Having lived in Colorado for over 20 years, there's really a remarkable diversity of perspectives and lifestyles across the state, from the urban centers to the most rural and wild areas, some in the country. And how do you see the agricultural community being represented in terms of public opinion and attitude and awareness across the state more generally? One of the things that's attracted us to create the Yampa Basin Rendezvous was a sense of this collaboration and cooperation. And part of what we're trying to do with the YBR is to bring people from different walks of life, different roles, including the wonderful presentation today by Mike, and all the way to yourself and Kevin, the top of state government, and all of us in between, and scientists. So I think our rendezvous has helped a little bit to bring greater awareness of the incredible role and resilience and role modeling of the agricultural community. How well is that happening across the state?
Gosh, that's a great question. Anecdotally, as I've been out in the field, what I'm hearing from producers is that it's not getting better, that they feel more disconnected from sort of the voting base, the population base in the state than previously. And that's been a growing trend. Now that's just anecdotal through conversations, but I think that's a lot of the lived experience I'm hearing from producers. At the same time, there are a lot of folks in the ag community who are recognizing sort of their own agency and addressing that, and speaking here like Mike, and he was on our Yampa Basin tour and talking to the Colorado Sun and putting quotes in the Denver Post and inviting people out to their farmer ranch and feeding people incredible food. And I think that relationship goes both ways. So do I think we have a long way to go? I do. I think that the issue of the divide, whether, at least the perceived divide across our sort of population centers and rural areas, still feels really palpable to a lot of folks in ag and a lot of folks in rural communities. But at the same time, there are folks on all sides who don't believe that narrative and don't want to believe that, and are really investing in relationships, are investing in shared understanding, are thinking about sort of exchanges between, urban and rural. And I think the more and more of that we do, the less we judge, the more questions we ask, the more we actually show up out on the landscape with each other, just like these tours that we've gotten to do. That's where I have hope that we're going to move forward with just a deeper understanding of what our lives look like.
Thank you very much. And I'll just say we would welcome any input and advice on how we can enhance the ability of YBR in its own little small way to help contribute to that.
Thank you so much, Kate. We're going to go ahead and move on to the final panelist. Any remaining questions? It looks like a few outstanding ones have come in. We will be saving to hopefully come back around to when we do the large panel discussion. So thank you again, Kate. So our next panelist is Rob Billerbeck. Thanks so much for joining us today, Rob. Rob Billerbeck is the Colorado River Coordinator for the National Park Service out of the NPS Denver office. He coordinates internally and externally regarding water and resource issues related to the Colorado River for the NPS, Colorado River Steering Committee, and for the 10 national park units that participate in this committee. He was the NPS project manager, along with his Bureau of Reclamation co-lead counterparts, on the Glen Canyon Long-Term Experimental and Management Plan Environmental Impact Statement from 2011 to 2016. Rob has a master's degree in sustainable development and conservation biology from the University of Maryland. Prior to his work with the National Park Service, Rob was the head of the Colorado State Parks Natural and Cultural Resources Stewardship Program. He has managed a variety of programs for state parks, including ecological and cultural inventories, resource planning and compliance, GIS, forestry, invasive species, and conservation programs. And Rob, as I turn it over to you, would you mind by starting off letting us know what watershed you're joining from today?
Sure, you bet. I am in the Bear Creek watershed. That's part of the South Platte watershed, but most of the water I drink is from the Colorado River, which I'm not sure how many people in my community actually are aware of that or who they share that water with. So I agree with the last conversation that there's plenty of room for more education and awareness. And Anna, should I go ahead and try and share my screen and do the slideshow from here?
Yeah, please go ahead, and I'm happy to share them from my side if you have any difficulties.
All right, well, let's give it a
Okay.
shot and see how this goes. And hopefully you're now seeing a slideshow.
Looks great.
Great. And so I am the Colorado River coordinator for the Park Service. So what does that mean? What it and I'm gonna move some things around on my screen so I can read my notes. It means that I try and coordinate within 10 park units and with a number of our partners for the National Park Service mission, which is to maintain the resources in our parks in an unimpaired condition for the enjoyment of future generations. So we're kind of in the forever business of the public trust of these really special lands. And that is, of course, pretty difficult to maintain everything in the park just as it was in the past when we have a large river running through it that is providing services to 40 million people, 1/8 of the country. So, you know, we are concerned about the native fish, the vegetation, the sandbars, the channel, as well as the enjoyment of those areas via recreational fishing and boating. But really what I do is I attend a lot of dam meetings. So a lot of meetings about Flaming Gorge, Glen Canyon, Aspinall, and other dams, and look at the issues that we have in terms of how the rivers are managed and try and coordinate between our 10 park units so that hopefully we all row in the same direction on a lot of those concerns, and then coordinate with all the stakeholders, the other federal agencies, the states, the tribal nations, and many of the different interest groups. So just the list of parks that I work with is there, from up in the headwaters in Rocky Mountain National Park all the way down to Lake Mead. And so it's really over 1,000 miles of river between the tribs and the main stem. And just to highlight, you know, we have between those combined park units over 26 million people visiting a year. So just to note that when we contrast that with the population of places like Utah, where there's about 3.2 million people, that's a lot of people coming to visit these areas and spending a great deal of money to the order of about 2.3 billion for that ecotourism to visit these special places. And again, that's, you know, compared to about a $17 billion state budget for places like the state of Utah. So the general public cares quite a lot about these special areas. So it's an important piece of the West. And as we've talked about, there's a number of reasons why it's really important that water gets delivered to certain places at certain times for drinking water, for our farms and ranches, as Kate highlighted. And our role as NPS is just to highlight, what happens along the way in that river with the natural elements in that river. So we are concerned with those critters in the river, the native and endangered fish, the macroinvertebrates that support those fish, as well as some of the recreational fisheries. We're concerned about the shape of the channel and the vegetation along it. What really provides us that ecosystem health along the riparian corridor. On an arid landscape, though the riparian corridor may make up only 1 or 2% of the land area, it's incredibly important to the life cycles of all of the species there. And of course, the enjoyment of that river is important. But we are concerned with the shape of that natural hydrograph. So, and trying to find ways and compromises that the river can be managed to provide all those services and still accommodate the natural species that evolved with a particular timing and particular magnitude of flows there. But this year, I'm spending quite a lot of time thinking about what the heck happened this year, the short-term hydrology concerns. Just to highlight, that's a huge issue for our resources and recreation for the National Park Service, as well as I know for every other of the 40 million users of this river. And as you all are probably aware and have experienced, the dry soils last year were historic and record breaking. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but of course, on the drought map, we had all reds and purples. And in terms of these curves here from NRCS, we were outside of the averages we've seen for many years. And then of course we got pretty good snowpack, about almost 90% of normal, but it only turned into 30% of the average runoff. So that was uncharacteristically bad. It was literally off the charts for the minimum probable that reclamation projects. So, the question that we have is that worsening drought, is that climate change compounding, is that the future just aridity in the West that we can expect for the future? And of course, a number of researchers are looking at that and now have the ability to tease out what is weather and what is climate, much more than they used to be able to do. So I think we'll have some good answers to that, but certainly when we look at climate change projections, we don't have a great optimism that this will go away in a few years. And when we only see 30% of average runoff, or about 3.3 million acre feet of unregulated inflow into PAL, that is definitely dramatic when we're shipping 7.48 million acre feet downstream. And so, of course, for our NPS operations in place, like Glen Canyon National Recreation Area at Lake Powell, that led to some very, very rapid drops in our water level, and some huge issues in terms of our boat ramps. Very historic changes. And again, I think you can see here on the screen, we've got, the low water alert to the public. I've added to our information off the website just some colors here for, out of our 11 boat ramps, you can see how many are closed. You can see some are partially open, only one is fully open. This example off to the left is a partially open. Note that means no trailered boats are launching there. As you can see, that is only kayaks that are launching. So even partially open is very partial at this time. So I think that's a dramatic way to show, the the change that we've experienced this year. And it, of course, doesn't affect just recreation. It affects a great number of things. And even to say just recreation, I showed you those billions of dollars in regional spending. But I think it's also important to just think about the people's lives that are connected to providing this recreation at these biggest reservoirs in the West. And certainly even, the spouses of many of our employees at places like, Lake Powell and Lake Mead are very concerned about their future livelihoods. So, and, just to put it out there, I mean, the Park Service gets a lot of criticism for this. And of course, as you all, I hope, know, Park Service is not in charge of managing those water levels. That is done with, the states in cooperation with Bureau of Reclamation. But we try and read the tea leaves, look at the projections. And the projections, on the latest 24-month study have 150 feet of range in what we might see at Powell. So to manage things like boat marinas and try and determine when they will be in mud and when they will be, in water is exceedingly difficult, and requires a great deal of fast action with years like this one. So in the big picture, we're a small part of what has been done to plan for this kind of year. So I just want to highlight, what the states and reclamation have done, and then just talk about our role in it as one of the entities that coordinates with the states and reclamation. So there were big drought contingency plans put in place in 2019. In the upper basin, there's a drought response operation agreement. And the guts of that are really to move water to Powell from some of the upper basin reservoirs when needed. In the lower basin, there are shortage tiers to try and keep more water in Mead. And I guess the point of my talk that I'm going to keep coming back to is how it is all connected. And we are seeing that this year more than we ever have. That's been kind of a, almost a cliche that it's all connected. But I tell you what, every aspect of my job, many of which used to involve separate meetings, are now all connected. There is nothing that I now do that isn't connected between all 10 of those park units I work with. So just to highlight this upper basin Drought response, there was an emergency response put in place this summer. And when I say emergency, there was a very short timeline between the states and federal agencies and others getting together to plan on that and when water started moving. For government operations, that sort of rapid change is not something I've seen in my career. So pretty historic, but moved a lot of water from Flaming Gorge, from Blue Mesa, and from Navajo down to Powell. And just to highlight how all that's connected, at Blue Mesa Reservoir, we had a plan for how the water levels would proceed throughout the year. And that plan changed drastically and took us down to levels below what we had historically seen. So just in terms of our park superintendents, what that does is it requires them to work with concessionaires who run things like boat marinas and docks. And I think when a lot of people envision docks, they think of wooden boards. And that's not what our docks look like. We have buildings, restaurants, sailing schools, and many, many boat slips on those marinas. And when water levels change rapidly, we have to do things like spend a great deal of money to move those facilities and all of their electric, water, and sewer into deeper water. And that can't really be done until we know what those levels are going to look like. And it affects, again, people's jobs in that area and the spending in these counties. So that causes a lot of aspects that we didn't plan for really rapidly. And that might sound like I'm questioning as Park Service this operation, and I want to correct that immediately and say that there are a great deal of reasons why that water was moved. I think there's a perception from the general public that is just to keep recreation at Lake Powell. And I want to highlight that, again, even though I bristle at the thought of just recreation, given all of the regional spending, all of the people's livelihoods, I also want to highlight that there's a great deal of other concerns coming into play for the power grid, where we're changing to alternative energy, and hydropower is an incredibly important piece for that. And out of Glen Canyon, that's important. But even more so for the concerns for my agency are things like endangered fish. And as the lake level at Powell decreases, concern about the passage of warm water non-native fish through that dam down into the Grand Canyon is becoming much greater. So that affects all of the recovery efforts for native endangered fish in the upper basin. If we pass a lot of warm water non-natives that we've never seen in the Grand Canyon, and that affects some of our best population of species like humpback chub, that could be a very big game changer. So this really is all connected and is requiring a great deal of coordination and collaboration, but at kind of light speed. And again, to highlight how it's all connected, even though we're an upper basin group talking here, this is the lower basin where they're implementing for the first time a shorted schedule. This looks like a very unexciting government graph or government table. But again, for the sorts of issues that Kate highlighted, this also affects ranches and farms, as well as a number of resource issues in the lower basin. Certainly affects Lake Mead and its communities and regional economy. And I guess what I really want to highlight is it is all connected for 40 million Westerners. And again, another cliche is we're all in this together, but that has never been so abundantly clear to me than it has been this year. And I think, you know, this problem has to be dealt with by coordinating amongst all of those user groups, collaborating at a level and at a speed that we have not done before. Again, there's a lot of different watershed groups. And when we look at these problems for the future, and I just have this temperature graph up showing, you know, one of the big drivers of all of this change is simply temperature increase over time. That affects water evaporation. It affects a number of things that I'll talk about a little bit more, but for us to try and collaborate and solve problems, we have to really have a common acknowledgement about the problem. And I think there's a lot of struggle with that. I think particularly when the word climate change is used, there's a lot of politics associated with that. But the reality is that there is a great deal of established science showing us that this temperature level is increasing, and there's really no dispute about that in terms of the science. And it's really important that we move past those politics and that debate to think about how all of this is working together, how, you know, these changes may affect precipitation patterns. But again, even precipitation is not really the whole story because of that temperature increase. So even if we get an average precip year, that doesn't necessarily turn into average runoff. That was a dramatic example this year that we saw. But there is a lot of variation that we see in different models. And I think a lot of it is due to the jet stream, there's a lot of research that's just on the cusp of telling us more about what we might see in the way of precipitation in the future in this basin. But again, no dispute, a great deal of agreement in the science on the temperature. And then snowmelt and runoff sooner really affects what happens to our soils and what happens to our streams. That timing that I talked about, that natural timing for all our organisms, that's changing with that runoff. And then we have a whole number of complex feedback loops with dry soils, that evaporation of, that moisture. The great sponge, I think, is what we should call the last year, where the reason we didn't see that runoff is because those dry soils sucked back up so much of that water. But then we have other feedback loops of dust and ash. So the fires that we've seen as the soil dries out and dust is carried up, and that settles onto the snow and we have quicker runoff. All of that works together. Fires, we get really rapid runoff. We see changes in vegetation that will change the speed of that runoff as well. And then when we have heat waves, like we've seen this year in different places, that changes that demand for crops, that Kate talked about. It changes, what's done in cities, and have, a lot of concerns about the future in terms of what that will do to conversion of cropland and at what rates. So all of that works together for a pretty complex picture on climate change that I think is a really important thing for all of us to think about in that collaboration. We really have to look at the problem and really have a common agreement about that problem in order to move forward. And just to take that one step further, I've got some animations I didn't know I had. Yep, there we go. Sorry about that. Our water availability does appear to be decreasing. Agriculture is a huge proportion of that use. And so the question is, as we look in supply and demand in the big picture, how do we all collaborate? We are very interested in being a part of that picture as the National Park Service, try and advocate for the long-term preservation of those special places that we're in the public trust for. And there's a lot of ideas that are starting to be circulated, and certainly the National Park Service doesn't advocate for any one of these in particular, but certainly the white papers from the Future of the Colorado River Group, the 10 strategies that have been put out by a group of NGOs are interesting ideas that I think should be looked at as part of the conversation. Because we certainly have to collaborate on that. And just in case anyone on this call isn't aware, there's a big new planning process that the Bureau of Reclamation will be starting on this year that informally is called either the Interim Guidelines 2.0 or the Post 2026 Planning, that may look at options for changing the way water is moved between Lake Powell and Lake Mead on an annual basis. And again, if folks along the Yampa aren't sure that that means anything to them, I will say again, it is all connected, and that will have intimate influences on the entire basin. And I think with the sort of year that we've seen this year, it's a crux point where that collaboration really needs to be at a level that we have not done before in this basin. And again, I think we have 40 million Westerners with interest in what is done over that 5-year planning process. And so we, as the Park Service, I've been talking about what others can do, and that's easy to do. So what about what we're doing? Again, we are doing our best to coordinate on that. We were joint leads on some past processes like the LTEMP for the Glen Canyon Dam. We expect to ask to be a cooperator on this larger process. We expect to be a good cooperator that brings a lot of information to the table on the resources in our parks and our influence on that regional recreation. So we're working with USGS on a number of models that we think will be useful to evaluate a lot of those questions on the Green River, on the Colorado River, for all 10 of those park units that I talked about that might be influenced by this process. We also are doing a whole lot of recreational access planning and construction at those big reservoirs, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and trying to take a long look with our planning at what the future may look like there and all of the opportunities and the risks we have for that long term. And to coordinate with all the other partners on fish issues. I think the Upper Basin Recovery Program and San Juan Recovery Program have never been more important than with where we're headed with what could be some dramatically different operations out of dams in the coming years. And so I think we, as the Park Service, have great concerns about coordinating on that. And just briefly, for the NPS as a whole, we do a great deal of climate monitoring and research, a great deal of planning for how we build our facilities, what types of recreation we have available and how that influences climate change, and how we might try and adapt as our landscape changes. We are seeing, landscape level changes to our vegetation and the movement of our wildlife in a lot of that research. So we are trying to figure out how we plan for that while being in the forever business of trying to preserve these special places. And we're also doing what we can by doing things like putting out a great deal more electric charging stations. Hopefully when people take those long road trips and they try and do it with electric vehicles, they are probably going, we think, to those beautiful national parks, some of which are way out in the middle of nowhere. And we want to provide them with places to charge their vehicles. So that is some of what we are doing. And that is a taste of my job in trying to coordinate on all of those intimately connected processes on the Colorado River.
Thank you so much, Rob. I appreciate wrapping up with this talk in terms of formal presentations so that it brings us back to that big picture question of we've been thinking a lot about drought in humans, we've been thinking a lot about drought in soil quality, and now this brings us back to that bigger picture of how do the natural systems influence our water supply, and in turn, how does our water influence those natural systems? So thank you for that. In the interest of time, I am going to move us into larger panel discussion to make sure that we do have lots of time for broader conversation here. And I also want to just address all of our participants beyond the panelists. We are going to be moving through specific questions. We are welcoming new questions as we talk to our panelists, but as has been clear throughout this session, collaboration across different communities is a really critical part of successful strategies moving forward in addressing drought. And so I would just like to encourage people to share in the chat if you have thoughts about the questions that come up or personal experiences with different strategies for addressing drought that you would like to share. As long as you do so respectfully, we do want to treat everyone in this room as someone who is bringing a lot of value to the conversation. Please do feel free to share personal thoughts and experiences about strategies for adaptation that you have experienced in your work or personal life. So as we're waiting for people to digest that, we're going to go ahead and return to some of the questions that we have. First off, this is a question for Rob, Carrie, and Kate. This is a question that was also posed to the previous panel, but Julie Vano would really appreciate hearing your perspective on this. What information about future changes in climate would help you in your work? Any one of you is welcome to jump in.
So this is Carrie. I'll take a shot at that first. So our water managers within the Corps and in the reservoirs that we're mostly dealing with now. Now there's a the Corps' portfolio of reservoirs is hundreds of dams, and so they range from very, very large to much smaller. And so there's a big disparity there, but most of them, they're dealing with things really kind of a week to or less in some of their operations. But when you get to the much larger reservoirs, and that they would, if they could have forecast information, kind of on what I learned from my meteorological colleagues is what they call the seasonal to subseasonal scale. And planning for future operations, that would be wonderful to be able to have insights into that. But of course, that's that's not necessarily impacted by climate change. That's just something that they would love to be able to have a better handle on. Now, in terms of climate change, what we're seeing, of course, is that there's, and I mentioned this in a response to a comment that was posted in the chat, that we're seeing kind of more extreme extremes, if that makes any sense. That in just using the Russian River, where our first pilot, the driest 3 years on record in California were 2012 to 2015. It was followed by the wettest year on record in Northern California in 2017, and now we're back into drought again. So, we're just seeing these extremes. It's bouncing back and forth between super wet or super dry. And, and that presents a whole host of challenges there. Thankfully, our infrastructure is designed for the extremes. When you build a dam, you want to look at, well, what's the worst it could be in terms of rainfall and what's the driest it could be. And so you want to be, deal with both of those situations. The problem is that we're seeing that some of those extremes, what we thought was the wettest it could be may not be. It may be that it can get wetter, or it could be that could get drier than we ever thought it could be, or that has been in recorded, going back to the on record. So that presents another challenge there. And so being able to have our existing infrastructure be able to work harder, so to speak, in other words, do better with what it can in terms of how it operates, is something that we're trying to do more of, trying to figure out how to make the existing infrastructure that we have be able to handle that. And Rob's presentation really kind of highlights some of those extremes that are being experienced right now, and the challenges that we have, and just, and its impacts to recreation and to the economy of that people use these resources for. It's not just the water supply side of it, it's all of the other aspects as well that have such a huge impact to a part of the country that many of you live in, and that millions others come and enjoy, including myself. So what if we could know, just how extreme the extremes are going to get, then we would be in a much better position. The problem is that that's a really hard thing to figure out, because we're trying to guess the future there. And there's, one thing that we have learned so far is that, as you make plots of, like Rob's plots of temperature, and you can look at rainfall and other things, and the slopes on those lines are just increasing. And so it's hard to know exactly what the end of that looks like. How extreme will it get? And if we had a good answer on that, then we would know, how much drought do we need to design for? How big of floods do our reservoirs need to be able to hold when it decides to rain a lot? So those are the challenges that we have. And if we had answers on that, then we would feel a lot more comfortable. I think right now we're just a little apprehensive about that, because we don't know how extreme it's going to get. Thanks.
And just to add on to that, one thing that we've been talking quite a bit about this year is the soil moisture deficit in the high country, and how, despite the fact that we had a decent snowpack, relatively speaking, we had a unequivalent runoff, right? And so we can't actually equate snowpack to spring melt anymore because of that soil moisture deficit. And also talking to some folks about our need to monitor, really expand our monitoring at the mid elevation levels where we are seeing that soil moisture deficit. I think that is going to help producers in understanding what quantity of spring runoff is going to look like for irrigation throughout the season. And then timing, this is something that was predicted, and now we're seeing it as timing of runoff is changing, which of course leads to a lot of management decisions for producers. I think those are big ones for ag to know, so we can plan for our irrigation season. Evaporative demand and sort of how those extremes that Carrie's talking about will change evaporative demand for crops. That would also help us as an agency as we're trying to invest in resilience tools like soil health. We also just created the Office of Agricultural Drought and Climate Resilience, which we'll be building over the coming months and years. And I think the more that we kind of know the timing, the quantity, the change in pressures like evaporative demand in different regions, especially different growing regions of the state, the more we can sort of target our strategic tools like soil health, stewardship, potential for new crops, more drought tolerant crops, or different patterns across the state that we need to be looking at to make sure that we're continuing ag across Colorado, but also responding to the realities of water scarcity and ongoing drought. Those are just some of the few, I think, additional data points that would be very helpful for us in planning for growing seasons.
Yeah, I'll add to that a little too. I mean, for the Park Service, yeah, we would absolutely love to see further development of hydrology models that could project a little more accurately and take into account more of the climate factors. The core of most projections are still, replays of past years. And it's just clear that we're moving outside of the range of historic conditions where that is less useful. But it sounds like we're also not yet fully in a place where those climate models are ready to provide a better projection. And we're hoping that comes along in the next few years to really pull together all of these factors and provide more accurate projections at a basin level here. Also, hope along with those changes on the supply side of the water that, folks are thinking about modeling the demand side and how that might change and what those feedback loops look like, because that certainly affects what, is actually in our reservoirs downstream. And so, there's not that much modeling about these changes that we're starting to see to our landscape, to our agriculture, that may be important feedback loops on that. So we hope that we see that.
Thank you, guys. The next question, I'm going to combine two questions we've received for Rob. But after Rob has answered, I would like to broaden the question a little bit and throw it back out to Carrie and Kate as well. So Rob, Nathan Stewart wants to know, post-2026 planning is likely to result in unintended winners and losers important to our national parks and the West at large, natural and cultural heritage, economies, ways of life. Do you have specific concerns about this process as they relate to NPS critical resources? And then the second question I would like to tie into that is Rachel Santee was curious about the vulnerability of national parks. Are they more or less vulnerable to non-park spaces than non-park spaces? So to kind of summarize the whole, that was a really long question. Thinking about the post-2026 planning, what are concerns that you have about winners and losers? And how does this play into thinking about not just national park vulnerability, but vulnerability of lands outside of the parks? Kind of how do those two interplay? So that was a lot to digest, sorry.
No worries. No, that's a good set of questions. I mean, the reclamation IG 2.0 or post 2026 hasn't formally started yet. So they're just starting to pull that together. So there aren't any formal alternatives out for that. There are ideas being discussed about that, like those in that Future of the Colorado River White Paper number 6, but those are other folks' thoughts, not reclamation. So it's hard to comment on, how specific alternatives might affect the Park Service since there aren't any yet. But we are, of course, absolutely concerned about that. My job is to make sure our park units aren't losers in that process. So we are trying to coordinate very closely as that process leads towards opening up and starting. And like I say, we're doing a lot to try and get ready for it with our resources. I do feel like the park service units are probably more sensitive to these issues than other lands, given our mission, given that our mission is, a very high bar to try and maintain those resources, in really as close to pristine condition as we can get along managed rivers. That is a high bar for us to try and manage to. So that does have a lot of sensitivity to what happens with the decisions in that process, and really any water management processes on these rivers. So that's probably not a greatly satisfying answer, but how that water is moved, the timing with which it is moved, the magnitude of seasonal peaks greatly influences the resources in those rivers, because everything evolved along that natural cycle. So I'll end with that thought.
Thank you so much, Rob. So the way I wanted to kind of throw this question back out to Carrie and Kate was to think about, certainly ideally you'd create a situation like Carrie talked about where everyone at the table is a winner and there are no losers, but occasionally there are trade-offs that happen. And so the question that I had for Carrie, Kate, and Rob, you're welcome to jump back in if you have additional thoughts to share, is what advice do you have for finding common ground as you meet these gnarly problems, and for addressing spots where there might be conflicting interests at the table?
So I'll speak to that just briefly, that and I'll kind of point back to the approach that we've used so far in FIRO, is that the more opportunity that there is for dialogue between stakeholders, between groups with differing perspectives and differing missions, the more we get to understand what each other's concerns are. And I'll use a specific example. NIMS is the National Marine Fisheries Service, right? And so that's part of NOAA, but they're mainly a regulatory agency in that many of the reservoirs that we have in the West have spawning salmon downstream of those. And so NIMS is the regulatory agency because they're ocean-going fish that spawn in the streams. And so there's biological opinions, for example, on the releases from Lake Mendocino. And in one of our steering committee meetings that we had at some point along the way, fairly early on in the process, some of the water managers for the reservoir, for the Corps of Engineer water managers, made a comment. They said, hey, and if we operated it like this, that would be better for the fish, right? And so the National Marine Fisheries representative just about fell out of his chair because he couldn't believe that the Corps was trying to accommodate his perspective. But that gets to my point of that when we understand that our particular interest is okay, right? I think most people understand that they can't always win. They always can't get their way, but when they understand that their perspective is at least heard and represented, then they can be much more accommodating. They can look for ways to have their objective met as well as other objectives. And who wouldn't want to do that, right? These people live there. They see the benefits for each other's perspectives, but it takes time to build that trust. And it also takes time to understand what the other perspectives are. And so that's not going to come in just a, once a year or so meeting. It may take a little more than that. So there's an investment of time that's involved there. But what we have found is that it's time well spent, because it saves you so much effort down the road, because you can spend a lot of time being contentious about decisions when it comes time to make a decision. And there's, back and forth that goes on if you haven't built that trust. But if you invest it up front, then it saves you so much time further down the road, because there isn't contention now about the decisions, because everyone has felt like their perspectives were heard and accommodated as you approached coming to that decision. So that's, I guess, the comment I would make from our perspective.
And Elise, on that question, which I actually I might answer the next question in the chat from Nathan at the same time, because it the example I want to give touches on that. But, what I'm seeing in the ag community is when we are at the table taking initiative to address reality, that puts us on our toes. When we take the opposite approach and trying to deny what's going on, which we can't do this year. I don't know anybody in ag who's denying what's going on this year because they're living it day to day. But if, I think that's where I see the most success. We say, okay, here's the reality of the situation. We're going to come to the table on our own as a community or as a basin or as a group of producers working in collaboration with the conservation community, what have you, to stick our necks out and try something new. And I see it as a role of the state, especially my agency, to try and absorb some of that risk, whether it's financial risk or social risk that producers are taking in trying out new things. If I can just jump to the next question, which was around, is there a future for fallowing in the state given our realities, which is a great question. There are a number of examples, I'm going back to the San Luis Valley, where that sort of self-organizing, local organizing has been happening for a long time. There are producers down there who have felt the real lived impact of the aquifer levels for a long time and have been trying to figure out both collectively and individually how to deal with it. So producers have made the choice to take out cash crops and put in a cover crop rotation, where you're not getting, sort of bare land fallow. You actually have a root in the soil. You've got covered ground, which is really important to soil health, future arability of that land, water retention in that land. And they actually lease, some of them are leasing circles in cover crop to ranchers, which actually has a pretty incredible social benefit because, sometimes there's a pretty strict divide between the farming and ranching community in certain places. So they're now, ranchers looking for good forage, good pasture for their livestock, farmers looking to save water while staying in business, put in a cover crop, build that soil health, retain moisture in the soil, get some revenue for that leased ground for livestock grazing, and next year have a healthier soil to grow out your cash crop in that next season. So, I think that's just one model. There are others. There's also, CRP ground, and of course, in those groundwater short basins, this question of fallow and the extent that it's permanent or temporary is a big question, both in the Rio Grande and the Republican basins, but of course elsewhere as well. But in my mind, the fallow can't be fallow alone. We're going to have to look at reduced consumptive use, but how do we do that with investing in productivity and investing in stewardship? And I think the model I just described is one of many versions of what that rotation could look like.
So I would just add a couple things to Carrie and Kate's comments. I mean, I think Carrie nailed it with having to understand, the other stakeholders' perspective in order to sit down with respect to solve it. And I think through with Kate's comments about a lot of the alternatives available for managing some of the issues with ag land, I think the challenge for this coordination is the pace at which things might move. And I would just highlight that one of the essential components for collaboration is that parties aren't suing each other at that moment at which they're trying to collaborate. And there's a great danger in this system of litigation overtaking collaborative processes. And I think that the pace of collaboration on issues like the Upper Basin demand management process, which would be a voluntary process to get at some of the things Kate was talking about, that the pace of that may have to pick up to try and get to a place where we are staying ahead of any potential for litigation. And the other thing I would just throw out that I learned from working on the Glen Canyon Dam on the LTEMP process years ago is that one of the things that really helped us was when we had a modeling basis of a lot of the issues. It took a lot of things that looked black and white or looked like there was a huge range on, and brought them down into a band of what was actually possible in terms of impacts or solutions. And that made it a lot easier for people to talk. When you're talking about positions as if, they were completely black or white, it's a lot harder to get to agreement than if you realize it's only a 10 or 20% difference on things. So quantitative models can be hugely valuable in promoting collaboration.
Well, thank you so much to all of you. We do have 3 remaining outstanding questions, one for each of you actually, but we don't quite have time to get to them. We're running up on the end of the rendezvous here, but we will be sending these questions out to our panelists. So if you're someone who asked a question, you're like, oh, I wanted to know their answer. Our hope is to let them reflect on those questions afterward, and we can share that when we share where to find video recordings of the links and so on. So I really want to just take a moment to thank all of our 3 panelists one last time for this really great insight and discussion we've had today. I hope that, like me, many of the rest of you are also leaving this particular session with feelings of hope that dealing with drought is a complex and frightening problem a lot of times, but I think there's been this key theme today of opportunities for collaboration and how much can be achieved when you have genuine collaboration happening and true communication across communities. So thank you all for sharing your particular perspectives on that. I'm going to hand things off to Marty Ralph for a few final thoughts on the Yampa Rendezvous.
Thank you very much. A wonderful session, and thanks for your presentations and the great questions. I have to say it's a bit overwhelming. We have covered a lot of ground in 2 pretty efficient mornings or into midday, and I'm left with a few quick impressions, and I have some other remarks I'll share, but just words like hope and inspiring and collaboration and cooperation really come to mind here. And I think we really put the words of Yampa Basin Rendezvous, a dialogue on drought, water availability and conservation, we brought those to life in the last 2 days. And I want to highlight one aspect of that is that the range of institutions and organizations represented. I just want to read the list that I just made a moment ago. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, USGS, National Park Service. On the federal side, that's a pretty good cut across major agencies involved here. On the state side, the Division of Water Resources, Department of Agriculture, Colorado Water Conservation Board, and then the River Network, the Colorado Water Trust, Aspen Global Change Institute, Maybell Irrigation District, YVSC, that's the Yampa Valley Sustainability Council, Cornell University, CU Boulder, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, Colorado Mountain College, Steamboat Ski Resort. We've had quite a diverse dialogue possible because of the attendance. I just want to thank everybody for their presentations and moderating and participation, because without that, of course, we have no dialogue. I want to capture a couple of quick quotes that really stuck with me. One is, and this came out from a number of people. Kevin from, the director of the Division of Water Resources highlighted the culture of collaboration and cooperation that the Yampa Basin has in his area. And I heard that repeatedly from others from different perspectives. And it's amazing, sort of, we've landed here as a rendezvous. Another one was from the Maybell Irrigation District representative, Mike. We can't manage what we don't measure. And, that's a really basic principle. And it comes back, brings me back to the science session where we heard about evapotranspiration and demand or heat and temperature are as important as precipitation, but we hardly measure the soil moisture, and yet it came up time and time again. The technology's out there, and we can do something about it. And it's one of our goals in the Yampa Basin Rendezvous is to, in addition to have a dialogue, is to trigger and stimulate some actions that could make a difference longer term. And I'm very pleased to say, as I mentioned in my report, we have, thanks to the Upper Yampa Water Conservation District, in a partnership between my group and the Colorado Mountain College and Yampa Valley Sustainability Council, we're starting to put additional, high quality, long-term soil moisture sensors in the ground. And I'm really hopeful that over time, we'll be able to look back and water managers and others will have those data available to use, and we'll be finding them of value. Maybe even the Yampa Basin itself serves as an example for other watersheds. Another thing was just the idea that the Yampa Basin Rendezvous really contributes to and is sort of representative of this culture of collaboration and cooperation. So hats off to all the organizers here. And we have on the screen there, the partners, and the organizing team. It's a lot of work behind the scenes to pull this sort of thing off. And I just really want to thank everybody for that. And then I just had one last bit here, sort of stepping back farther away. I'm thinking about, the world around us more broadly and, where we fit. And, the world's changing. The Arctic pack ice, multi-year ice was predicted by climate change experts to eventually decrease dramatically by 2050. Well, it sort of happened quickly back in the 2010s, much faster change than any of the models had predicted. In addition, we're seeing the ravages of wildfire across the West. And then we have the first ever declaration of a shortage for the Colorado River. These are, sentinel events in the changing world we live in. And I think we are in the Upper Yampa with all the community strength and dialogue and openness and our little contribution to it here. Hopefully we can be agents of action and change and response that will help build resiliency and hope for those who are affected and those who want to make a difference. So I'll close with that and just say thank you so much to everybody, and I wish you well.